Hey students, this is Professor Gordon. Part two of the 1950s culture is going to be really short because I want to cover the civil rights movement in the 1950s in part three. So let's talk about kind of the challenging of the stereotypes of the 1950s. And so as I mentioned in part one, the way television shows kind of portray the stereotypical family as the suburban housewife and so forth. And so you're going to see this new phase of the women's rights movement that is going to begin in the 1950s and particularly take off in the 1960s and 70s. And one of the most influential leaders of that part of the new kind of feminist movement or women's rights movement is Betty Friedan. And so she had been a suburban housewife at one point and then kind of got bored and tired of that and then wrote her famous book. So you can better definitely know this one for a test or a quiz and so forth. But it's called The Feminine Mystique. And one of the things that she challenged was she challenged that women to basically resist the stereotype that their job is to be suburban housewives and so forth. The new women's movement focused on challenging gender equality in the workplace as well as putting an end to sexual harassment. So pushing for equal opportunities for women in the workplace, also the end to sexual harassment in the workplace, and also equal pay for equal work, which we see even brought up to today as well. So really, even though it seemed that the stereotypical mom or wife or woman works or stays at home, about a third of American women in the 1950s held jobs outside the home. As the service sector expanded, so the demand for workers in jobs traditionally filled by women. More than 80% of all employed women did stereotypical women's works as salespersons, healthcare technicians, waitresses, stewardesses, domestic servants, receptionists, telephone operators, and secretaries, and so forth. In 1960, women represented only 3.5% of lawyers and 6.1% of physicians, but 97% of nurses, 85% of librarians, and 57% of social workers. Women were also typically paid less, with just 60% of what men made on average. Women that worked were no longer just young and unmarried. These women were middle-aged, married, and with children. In 1940, only 15% of wives had worked, but by 1960, 30% did. And by 1970, it was 40%, and it's going to go up in the 1980s as well. Married women worked to supplement family income, and even in the prosperous 1950s, the wages of men could not pay for what middle-class life demanded, which was cars, houses, vacations, college educations for their children. So poor households needed more than one wage earner just to get by. When women took jobs outside the home, they were still bore full responsibility for childcare and household management. So really, you still see the challenging of these traditional roles, particularly portrayed in movies and culture and so forth. And so it was commonly thought the majority of women were expected to join the PTA, clean the house, cook, raise the children and so forth, take the kids to Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and take them to sporting events and so forth. And a lot of TV and so forth reinforced that. But nonetheless, a lot of women worked outside the home. And even though it wasn't over 50%, you're going to see that number rise for adult women as the decades progress and so forth, particularly in the 1960s. When you see so many women entering college, you'll see more of them into the workplace in the 1970s. Now, also this new corporate culture was emerging as well, and so you even see movies portray this with the company man and like the man who in the gray flannel suit and so forth. Also, as I mentioned, the Cold War America lecture, for the first time, there's more white collar jobs and blue collar jobs in the United States, and you see this in the changing economy and so forth, and even culture things that came about. Now, there was also this new youth culture that was emerging, and you really see this especially when we talk about the 1960s and the counterculture movement, but particularly the rise of rock and roll. As more and more kids were coming of age with the baby boom and so forth, they became obsessed with musicians such as Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley and others. And later in the 1960s, it's going to be the Beatles and many other rock and roll bands that we associate with like Woodstock and so forth. Um, and so the word teenager actually came about in the 1950s. And because of the baby boom generation, companies began marketing to teenagers, as I mentioned in part one of this lecture. In 1956, advertisers project an adolescent market for about $9 billion for like transistor radios, for instance. They were like little small handheld radios. Also 45 RPM records, clothing, and fads such as silly putty, which my children even love silly putties. Also hula hoops. My daughter's been doing those in PE lately. Increasingly, advertisers targeted the young, both to capture their spending money and to exploit their influences on family purchases. Young people made up the largest audience for motion pictures. And so that's why you see movies like Rebel Without a Cause and so forth with James Dean and so forth. Also The Wild One with Marlon Brando. All of those were appeal to the teenage audience. You still see movies today that are designed to appeal to the teenage audience. Music really defined the teenage generation, though, with rock and roll. Elvis Presley, arguably one of the most important musicians of the 20th century because of his impact in the 50s and 60s. In fact, my parents went and saw him perform toward the end of his life in the 70s when they were dating and so forth. And so Elvis, when he first appeared on television at night, because of his dance, was seen as kind of somewhat sultry and scandalous. They only showed him from the waist up. They wouldn't show him from the waist down. There was one time he appeared on a late talk show where he was singing basically to a hound dog on his famous song, "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog," because they thought he was a little bit scandalous for that day and age. And between 1953 and 1959, record sales increased from $213 million to $603 million. And really, rock and roll is what's happening that. But also, one thing about Elvis that was cool is he actually took his music genre from the African American community in Memphis, and musicians like Chuck Berry and others. And what he did is he kind of took some of the sound and moves and so forth of the African American culture and blended it with white culture to kind of be a cultural divide and so forth, as he had many African American friends in the Memphis area. And so that kind of changed culture a little bit among the teenage population. And see these different teen shows and so forth, like Dobie Gill and so forth. And of course, James Dean ended up dying. He was kind of like the Brad Pitt of his area. He died in a motorcycle accident, I believe. And so still, though, the behavior rules of the day was you're supposed to obey authority. You need to control your emotions. Don't make waves, which is like, be different, fit in with the group. And then also don't talk about sex in public and so forth. And you're going to see this counter generation emerge. And you're going to see that that's going to change and so forth with these cultural dissenters. And really, we see the results of the cultural dissenters in the 1960s with the hippie movement. And so youth rebellion was really only one aspect of a broader discontent with the conformist culture of the 1950s. You see artists, jazz musicians, and writers express their alienation in personal art forms. And a lot of times you see a lot of cultural trends through music, art, literature, movies, and so forth. Jackson Pollock emphasized self-expression, the act of painting. Blacks developed a bebop kind of music style, and you see the bebop dance move was a very popular dance movement among the African American community and so forth. You also had this group called the Beat Generation, that was a group of writers and poets centered around New York and San Francisco who really kind of challenged the middle class conformity and suburban materialism. And two of the most famous writers of the Beat Generation is Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. What they did is they kind of glorified spontaneity, which you see with the hippie movement, sexual adventurism, which you also see with the hippie movement, drug use, which you also see with the hippie movement, and kind of this kind of unique spirituality. And so a lot of the hippies are going to be inspired by the Beat Generation of the 1950s. Also, another writer at this time that kind of challenged things was Alfred Kinsey. He was a professor, actually studied beetles for a while, actually the insect, and then wrote on this book, The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and the Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. But what's interesting is that a lot of his research was flawed. He researched the fringes of society, those that were pedophiles, people that were in prison and so forth, and concluded that premarital sex was common. It's actually not as common as his research showed because he wasn't really investigating a broad range of the human population in the United States and so forth. But You also see the same work on sexual behavior in the human female. And so his research and so forth was a little bit not accurate, as has been shown later, and so forth. And so I've talked about the beatnik generation. These guys influenced the hippie culture and so forth. Now, one of the things one of the last things we'll talk about in part two is immigration and migrants at this time. Because of the immigration restrictions in the 1920s, very few people came at this time, and so forth. Jews were eventually allowed to come after the Holocaust. Before the Holocaust, they really weren't, because of the immigration quota system of the 1920s. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 allowed 415,000 Europeans to come, and the Chinese Exclusion Act ended in 1943. Okay, the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act prevented radicals and communists from coming, but it also ended the exclusion that prevented Japanese, Korean, and Southeast Asians from coming. Many of these Chinese men living in the U.S. brought their wives over and created a more family-oriented community. Approximately 135,000 men, 100,000 women of Chinese origin were living in the U.S. And in 1960, most of them lived in New York State or California, and so forth. Now, with Latino immigration, after the national origins quota system went into effect in 1924, what you'll see is instead of immigrants coming primarily from Europe, post-World War II, we're going to see a lot of immigrants primarily coming from Latin America and Asia. And that's going to be a big shift in American history. And so particularly when the immigration restrictions get lifted in the 1960s, you're going to start seeing immigration start pouring it out again like it did around 1900. And so by the 1990s, you see immigration levels of basically almost what they were around the turn of the century. And so that was kind of interesting, and so forth. But one you'll see is that more and more Mexican workers will be coming. But because some were coming illegally, I talked about this in the Cold War America lecture, but President Eisenhower's administration and, well, Congress passed Operation Wetback that was designed to round up illegal immigrants. And yes, that was actually the name of it. I can't make that up, unfortunately. So a lot of Hispanics settled in Los Angeles, Long Beach, California, El Paso, and other southwestern cities. And so we're like see San Antonio and others. But many also went north, settling and creating a well-established Mexican-American communities in Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, and Denver. Puerto Rican migration also increased rapidly. If you remember, Puerto Rico was a territory acquired in the Spanish-American War, and later they're given citizenship in the early 1900s. So these are U.S. citizens just moving to, a lot of them moving to New York City. There was actually more living in New York than there were in San Juan, which is the capital of Puerto Rico. They faced conditions common to all recent immigrants: crowded and deteriorating housing, segregation, menial jobs, poor schools, and the problems of their bilingual existence. Also, because of what had happened in Cuba, which we'll cover when we get to the 1960s, actually starts out in the 1950s, Fidel Castro takes over with communism in Cuba and kind of really suppressed the middle class. So a lot of middle class Cubans said, "See ya," and they leave and they come to South Florida, and that's why Miami has such a large Cuban population. And a lot of them are middle class, and that's one reason why you see Miami is a very affluent city. You also see Indian relocation happening. In 1953, Congress passed a resolution authorizing a program to terminate the autonomous status of the Indian tribes and empty the reservations. The Bureau of Indian Affairs encouraged voluntary migration by subsidizing moving costs and establishing relocation centers in San Francisco, Denver, and Chicago, and other cities. Okay, there's about 60,000 Native Americans that migrated to the cities, but a lot of them settled in ethnic neighborhoods, like you see other ethnic groups as well, and they had some challenges there. And so that will be something that will inspire the American Indian movement that we'll see when we get to the 1970s, a little more aggressive minority movement and so forth. You also continually had the Great Migration after World War II for African Americans, leaving the South in large numbers, moving up to the West and northern cities for better jobs and better income, and also to escape prejudice. Okay. Another thing that also led to people leaving the South in large number of African Americans is the mechanical cotton picker. This also affected both blacks and whites that were poor, that were tenant farmers in the South, and a lot of them moved across the country. Also, whites in the Appalachia region, so the Appalachian Mountains, went to Cincinnati and Chicago. because of better job opportunities. So people tend to go where you can get the most income and provide a better living for you and your families. Now, there was also an urban crisis because of the massive move to the suburbs. You see so you see whites moving to the suburbs, and you see a lot of minorities moving into the places where they had once located. So, like, I'll give you an example. Dallas is a great example. You know, Hillcrest High School was predominantly either African American or Hispanic today. It was predominantly white until the white flight happened in Dallas. Bryan Adams High School, same thing. Woodrow Wilson and others. And you see that changing over the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so one of the things that you see is that the manufacturing sector was contracting because, as we'll see when we get to the 1970s and 80s, the economy shifts from manufacturing to more service industry jobs, and that kind of hits some of the skilled and unskilled job opportunities especially hard as we go along. Blacks also faced housing restrictions that took place. More schools were being segregated, not by law like in the South, but just by economics in the North. And we're going to see that civil rights legislation is eventually going to change that. And we'll see court orders that'll take place when we get to a later topic in this module. In the 1950s, the nation's 12 largest cities lost about 3.6 million whites while gaining about 4.5 million non-whites. So they're actually gaining population overall, but it was actually not Caucasians. Now, there was also a move for urban renewal. Seeking to revitalize city centers, urban planners, politicians, and real estate developers proposed raising blighted neighborhoods to make way for modern construction projects. These builders rarely consult the neighborhood and eventually forcing many of them to move. And these urban renewal projects displaced about 1.4 million people. Many of them, mostly black, would be moved into federally funded housing projects. And that's where we get the term the projects. It was a thing that was pushed for by LBJ and the Great Society as a way they thought was going to create this unique community and that poor people would thrive, and it actually is not effective. Many of these places mostly became these project big tall apartment areas become big centers of crime and hopelessness and so forth. And that's going to be an issue that is going to have to be tackled in later decades in American history. All right, part 3, we will cover the civil rights